Welcome to Shaping the Future. In this episode, I'm talking with Saima Wazed, who is one of the 25 experts advising the World Health Organization's panel on mental health, and she is also the founder of the not-for-profit Shuchona Foundation. Recently, Saima has also taken up the role of the Thematic Ambassador for the ClimateVulnerable Forum, or CVF, which represents 48 countries and 1.2 billion people who are on the front lines of climate change. There is a widespread tendency among many of us to view the climate crisis as a future issue. Many people feel extreme anxiety about what the future holds and the lack of progress being made to change to a sustainable course. The ClimateVulnerable Forum represents countries where populations are experiencing extreme impacts today, losing loved ones, livelihoods, and their homes. Saima highlights the parallels between the impact of extreme climate and the pressures that vulnerable people from all walks of life are faced with now in the COVID crisis. The question we must ask is whether we can now start to use empathy as a tool to make big leaps towards true sustainability beyond the confines of empty rhetoric. Thank you for listening to Shaping the Future. We have many more interviews to follow in this all-important year for climate progress. Please subscribe on your preferred channel to catch each episode. Saima, it's great to talk to you today. Before we speak about the work you do in more detail, can you give us a brief overview of what the ClimateVulnerable Forum is and who it represents?
Well, the ClimateVulnerable Forum was launched in 2009, and now it has 48 countries, which represents 1.2 billion people. And these are the most vulnerable countries that are there due to the geographical location of where they are, due to the many other vulnerabilities that they have. And so they have been most directly and most intensely impacted by climate change.
Okay, and if we just circle back to your wider experience and expertise in mental health and those kinds of challenges, how does climate change impact mental health? Because now you're kind of talking about, especially within the CVF, you're talking about the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. Can you share some thoughts on how these interact and what you see from that perspective as in terms of health issues and especially mental health issues within the ClimateVulnerable Forum?
If you simplify it, in mental health, really, when we see what's happening with COVID pandemic, you can't really separate the mental health aspect. Being unprepared and anxious about not knowing what is going to happen, what your present is going to be like, who you're going to lose, what your future is going to be like. Are you going to, lose your home because you can't pay for your bills because your job is gone? That is something that there's an economic, financial aspect that affects you mentally because you don't know, it's the unknown. So mental health, anxiety, the stress, all of that is very linked to everything that happens when you're impacted by climate change. You're losing your employment, you're losing your livelihood, you're losing your family and friends, you are losing your where you live, your roots, and you're into the unknown and having to restart your life at whatever stage you are without any of the resources and resource persons. So all of that is not just something that the safety and security that you need, but impacts you mentally as well. And that has an impact. We know the poor mental well-being is going to impact your physical well-being. So it's going to have physical health problems that stems from that you don't even recognize at first till it becomes so chronic. And the other part of it is that we unknowingly heading towards this sort of post-traumatic stress symptoms that we don't recognize. We're less mentally resilient to cope with other stresses that would come our way. So mental health fits right into that. And then if you add another component to it is that if you do have genetic factors, that you have underlying mental health conditions, whether it was diagnosed or not, whether treatment is being provided or not, that it's going to compound the effect and the impact is going to be a lot greater. And oftentimes what happens with mental health is most people don't really share it, they don't know it. Even if they have been getting some kind of a treatment, there's a lot of stigma involved with mental health. So it isn't something that's the first thing you're going to say. Like, I have underlying heart condition, I have diabetes. Those are people that are going to be able to verbalize it, say it, and seek the help. And we have the support mechanism that's provided for it. But for mental health, we don't. And many times the gap in the treatment can also have this huge impact. We see one of the biggest challenges. I mean, if you think about it, every 40 seconds, there's somebody that commits suicide. What leads to suicide? We have all of these actions that we have planned to prevent suicide. We create suicide hotlines. We have people reaching out. We have mechanisms for controlling the substances. So, a lot of rural areas and farming communities, fertilizers and stuff are often used. Poisons are often used. So they're stored away. It has some effect. So those are things that WHO is sort of promoting as actions that can be taken, because making items very easily accessible is an issue. But at the core of it, it's an individual's inability to deal with the stresses that they are going through, or not having the right support mechanisms. And by that, I mean not just what, say, a professional, a psychologist can provide. It's the support mechanisms that surrounded you. So yes, if you are in a natural disaster, you've lost all your family members. So you've lost everybody. Right? So you're completely alone. You've literally seen them pass away. So that is at one level, right? But at the other end, you have them, but they're all kind of dependent on you, and you don't know how to take care of them. So how do you help somebody overcome these sort of the challenges and be able to go on, not kind of give up on life? And many times, because of the social stigma that is involved with it, we tend to expect people to be able to deal with it and go on, move on. And they may not have the right support persons around them, because how somebody with a mental health condition expresses the underlying issues, the challenges that they can cope with, itself can be negative. So somebody with, say, extreme anxiety or depression may have behaviors. I mean, we all know about the cliche, sort of obsessive compulsive behaviors. That's very off-putting. That's very negative. So you tend to push away people, and they may have behaviors, they may have anger, they may have over too much sadness. So they will lose people around them because they almost want to be isolated, but yet that's the worst thing for them. Yeah. So there are those kind of things that goes on with mental health that we don't know about. And eventually things get to the point where the person has sort of played a part in isolating themselves and making them even appear more negative. At the same time, that causes them to head further downhill to other issues, loss of livelihood, other health conditions, and compounding it. And it always gets sort of lost in the conversation. And I'm not even talking about those who have chronic conditions and complex disorders like schizophrenia and already have bipolar disorder and other, personality disorders. I mean, there are so many. The other part of it is that I know categorically we have different names for different mental health conditions, but the symptoms that first might present may look just the same as any other thing. And you may think it's temporary, but having that information and knowing about it, you're going to be able to treat them very differently and sort of mitigate it, rather than creating a situation that that person may be self-destructive or destructive to other people. When the pandemic first hit in Bangladesh and we had our first lockdown, do you know that there were 5 suicides that happened? 3 of them were fathers. There was a young father who killed his wife and his 2 daughters because he had a huge debt. As soon as his business shut down, he knew he couldn't pay it anymore. Within the first week, we had those kind of cases rising from economic, financial challenges that he's going to face. And he didn't even have coronavirus, or he suspected it. And, there were all of these cases that happened right off the bat. So it's not something that's separate that we can put away. It's something we need to kind of address right away.
Okay, it's interesting that you're talking about it in the context of what's happening now with COVID and in the context of impacts like floods, for example. in Britain and in Europe, I know that we tend to talk more about psychological issues and anxiety around what's coming down the road in the future.
Yeah.
And we're getting mental health issues from what we're anticipating. And what you're talking about is that you're getting mental health issues from what you're experiencing. And it seems to be about building the resilience as much as a society to make sure people, because these are ordinary people responding to circumstances as opposed to what you were saying about known existing conditions. And can you talk a bit about that idea of how society plays a role in building resilience for each other as the pressure mounts? And it could be COVID or it could be a serious climate impact.
Well, we human beings, we live in communities. We've always lived in communities. And, and you feel that especially when it comes to disability and mental health the most, because the biggest challenge isn't what services are there, it's what support mechanisms are there. So if your community is there around you and you can help each other, that's a mechanism that's very underutilized. But when you actually look at the population, so say a displaced population is there, either through a flood or they're refugees or whatever reason that they may be, when the person is by themselves and they don't have others, they don't have the family members, but if they have a unit around them, the community around them, they help one another, they support one another. It can be both financially, food-wise, emotionally. Sort of being part of the community is something that's part of human nature.
So you're talking about systemic change. And
Yes.
if we don't make the systemic changes, which at the moment we're doing it very, very, very slowly, countries like Bangladesh, like the Maldives, like the Marshall Islands, etc., their plight is going to get much worse, much faster. Now we're visibly seeing as well in Australia, in America, you can see these fires in South America and even in the Arctic. How does the Climate Vulnerable Forum come to a conference like the COP and use its agency as a collective of representing over 1 billion people? I mean, it's enormous. How does it use its agency to say, no, this just has to stop? We can't just keep tweaking the system. It has to stop.
When you look at the population, you look at the number, we're a powerful number. It's a back and forth. We have to kind of meet both ways. But I think more than anything, the collective strength, the voice, and the individual stories. When you realize, we're a human being, I'm a mother, I'm a father, I have children to feed, I have a home that I want. Those are things that each and every one of us can relate to and understand. I think in the climate change conversation, we really need to talk from a personal point of view, how it's impacting. This isn't just, when we talk about families in Maldives, they're looking at their islands disappearing. Okay, their heritage will be gone. It's not just about, okay, we'll locate and go live somewhere else. No, their entire culture, their history, their identity of who they are is involved in where they've grown up. So not being able to hear these stories and relate to it causes this bigger gap. Climate change isn't something for the future. It is now. We are feeling it now. It's impacting our daily life right now. So the large number of population and the tremendous challenges that they face, and not just that they're facing it sitting quietly, that they are trying to come up with solutions desperately because the resources don't exist. Those are the messages that this forum can really give a louder voice to,
Yes.
And give because the platforms such as the events and stuff that happen in conferences, those are platforms that can be used much more advantageously for these vulnerable countries if you make it more personal, make it more relatable. Because when it's losing the same kind of things that you care about, then it will resonate with you. That's how human psyche works. Losing their homes, losing their livelihoods, losing who they are, losing their roots. And they're still trying, they're still happy, but what can you do about it and make it relatable?
If you could make one demand on behalf of the Climate Vulnerable Forum right now or coming up to the COP, what would it be?
I would say the one important thing is that we need much more cooperation and collaboration. We need solutions that are cross-cutting, because the issue is cross-cutting. We need different sort of forums, platforms, industries sort of working together. So environment is also a health issue. Health is an environmental issue. Industrialization and commerce is impacts the health, and the health impacts commerce. So there's so many interlinkages, and the most vulnerable group, the persons with disabilities, the persons who are economically challenged, the minority groups, the women, the children, those with mental health issues, these are the groups that are the most vulnerable. And they always lose out. And if we don't start working together in collaboration and come up with workable solutions to the issue of climate change, these vulnerable groups are going to continue to suffer the most. And they're already marginalized. They're already sort of an afterthought. And they won't even be remembered. And ultimately, this is the group we want to think of, or what would be the most beneficial, most helpful to the most vulnerable, and then work our way from there. And this also goes with the most vulnerable countries, right? That I think would be the ultimate. Like, we have to kind of think in a collaborative way. We have to kind of think in a cross-cutting way and not work in isolation, partner up and come up with solutions. We just can't wait anymore. We really can't keep waiting anymore.
And by helping the most vulnerable, we're kind of strengthening the whole fabric and ultimately helping ourselves anyway. And
Exactly.
So it makes a lot of sense. Well, look, thank you very much for speaking to me today. It's been fantastic.
Thank you so much. It has been a real pleasure.